So this morning we sort of looked at the more esoteric aspect of the human experience, and the awareness aspect of the human, which we can call the top-down approach. And the top-down approach tends to negate a lot of the human experience, so that as not important in a sense, and pointing at all the aspects of the experience that are changing in order for awareness to land on that which is unchanging. And in a way it says, thinking is the obstacle, thinking is what gets in the way. And we can be left with the impression that this journey is a journey of losing our humanness, or being completely still, no thinking. And that's really not where the journey is taking us. The journey is a journey that takes us to a place where we can live fully in life as this human being. So we find ourselves in life, living in life as the human being, and the life experience is an experience that contains suffering from time to time. Sometimes that time to time has got very short gaps in between it. So a lot of suffering. And suffering in practical terms means this uncomfortable feeling with oneself or with life, with the other. And that uncomfortable feeling can come in different intensities. Generally it's an uncomfortableness, and it arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. Under guilt, essentially at the bottom of guilt is lack of self-worth and shame. So, I'm not good enough. Up the top, guilt is, I feel guilty for not having helped my friend. That's guilt on a particular level. I'm not good. I feel guilty for not having helped my friend. I'm not good enough. And in its very intense version, it's I'm not worthy as a human being. I'm invalid. And that's shame. And in between guilt for, something simple like, I didn't ask my friend to come out to lunch with us when we went in a group, for example. And we can feel guilty about that. In between that and shame, there's embarrassment, there's insecurities of different sorts, all basically under this category of guilt. Blame, superficial blame is blaming someone for not leaving any milk in the fridge. The carton's in there. You go to pour the milk out of the carton, and there's no milk in the carton. And so we blame someone for not having bought more milk, let's say. The deepest blame is hatred for someone for what they have done, which is obviously more significant than using all the milk up. And in essence, we can say that shame is what pervades all forms of guilt. And obviously on the top level of guilt, the shame is mild. And hatred is what pervades all forms of blame. So if we blame someone for using up all the milk, really it's you hurt me, you've delivered pain in the moment, and so clearly the pain of not having milk in your tea is mild. But essentially it's you hurt me, I hate you for what you've done. Then there's pride, and pride in look what I've achieved, and it can include arrogance and a sense of superiority, which also includes a sense of the others being inferior, and it tends to want to be right. Pride wants to be right all the time and tends to not appreciate the other, so not value the other. So these are all the different ways that the suffering can arise in practical terms. And then there's worry and anxiety. So the first three forms, guilt, blame and pride, we can see the basis of that is an underlying belief that I'm the doer and the other is the doer. So when something happens and it's good, and it happens because of my actions, then the pride says I'm the doer, so I feel proud. If what I do is not good, the outcome is painful to someone else or to myself, then on the basis of doership, that's where the guilt comes in. I should have done it better. And seeing the other as the doer is why we feel intense hatred towards the other, because we see them as the doer. Now, the alternative is to see life as a happening, a creation, a story, effectively a story that was written before time started. In an instant, the whole story came into existence. And just like a storybook, each page is turned one page after another, and we just get to see the story that exists in the book. And the present moment is effectively the present page and the present line of the story. And the story manifests as the experience. And the experience in the present moment is the story. So it's not just a written story, it's an experiential story. This is the story in this moment. So if we see life as a predetermined creation, unfolding moment after moment exactly as it's predetermined, and we understand that the amount of pleasure and pain that we're going to experience in life is already determined in the story, and when we receive that pleasure and when we receive the pain is exactly as per the creation. That way, if pain exists in the moment, we might be able to say, oh, this was my destiny for it to be painful in this moment, and it was the destiny of the other to be the mechanism by which the pain was delivered to me. Which is very different to seeing the other as a doer, a separate, independent entity that is creating my pain because of what they decided to do. If we see the other like that, then life is very personal. And I have to hate the other for what they have done if I see that, if I see pain as an attack on who I am, which really means I believe that in order to be complete, I need pleasure, 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 pleasure. So with that belief that I need pleasure, 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 and I see the other as the doer, and I don't see life as a story, I see it as, life is an objective reality and everyone is making history as each moment goes past, then I have to really see the other as an enemy or a competitor, as a rival. At any moment they can hurt me, they can take what I need away, and so I have to live in a state of suspicion and fear. So to the extent that pain happens and I say, I was destined for there to be pain in this moment, and the other was the mechanism by which this pain was going to be delivered. It's not personal. Once again, not as a belief. If we just believe this and have a mantra and say, oh, this is what Ramesh said, this is what Roger said, it doesn't really work. To the extent that we can investigate life and start to really see that what is happening is much more a happening and much less our doing, less my doing and less the other's doing. Really, really see it, not by looking at the actions of the other and trying to see in like movement and physical movement that that's not their doing, but investigating the mechanics. And what's put forward is that the human being at any moment is one way, and that one way in that moment is based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's what makes the human being biologically and psychologically the way they are. And whatever happens is a result of the circumstance and the person and how the two come together. Just like two chemicals that have a particular chemical composition, the chemicals come together, there's a reaction based on the environment and the particular makeup of the chemicals. It's not optional. The reaction will be exactly as determined by all of these different variables. And humans are effectively complex instruments, like complex chemicals. The humans come together, or a human comes together with the situation, and there's a reaction. Sometimes a reaction that is pleasurable, and sometimes a reaction that's painful. And so if we drop any other beliefs or ideas of who I am and start looking at it objectively, along the lines of the pointers, we might really start to see, wow, time and time again, when I investigate this, I find not my doing, but a happening. So when someone would ask Ramesh, so I'm not the doer, what can I do to see this? He'd say, well, there's a point where you're not the doer, but if you have to have a practice, then practice this. And it's what he called personal investigation. Personal investigation of your own. If you currently don't see yourself as, or you don't see everything as a happening, and you see it as your doing, his suggestion is, at the end of the day, sit quietly. And he used to make a little joke, you don't have to sit in a particular position, just quietly, where you're not going to be disturbed. Turn off your phone. He said you can have a coffee, you can have a tea. He used to say you can have a beer or a sherry. And pick one action that happened during the day that you are convinced is your action. So, any other I'm not sure of, but this action I'm sure was my action. And then investigate it. And investigate it along these lines. Is it not true that what you call your action was part of a sequence that unfolded? That what came before is that you were in a situation, you saw something, you heard something, you smelt something, you touched something, you tasted something. So essentially you became aware of the circumstance that you weren't in control of. And what you saw, heard, tasted, touched and smelt, not in your control. And as a result of that, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, a continuation happened in the body. A thought arose, an action arose, based on something that you saw, smelled, tasted, etc. And the thought that arises is based on your makeup at that particular point in time, genes and up-to-date conditioning that you had no control over. You weren't in control of the parents you were born to, therefore you weren't in control of the genetics, and you weren't in control of how life impacted you moment after moment after moment. The genetics, one factor, how life impacted you moment after moment after moment, the other factor. That they work together, they're in harmony with each other. They're the two factors that make the human being what we are on a biological and psychological level. And you weren't in control of the circumstance you find yourself in. So what we call my doing, I am the one that pushed that person out of the way. My doing. And then we investigate it. Isn't it true that the person appeared in front of you and pushed into you? Were you in control of the perception of the person and the action that happened, being pushed? No, it happened. And then a thought arose and an action arose to push back, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance that you're not in control of. And each time that we investigate a situation that we are convinced is my doing, time and time again we'll see this sequence of events that started off with something I wasn't in control of, and all of the factors along the way I find are factors that I'm not in control of. And yet, for some reason, we say, I was in control of my action. So it's not particularly complicated, but if we don't do this investigation for ourselves, we might not see this. And so someone might hear the concept and say, well, I'm not convinced that I'm not the doer, but I'm going to do this exercise for 30 days. And so they sit down each night and they pick an event that they're convinced is their doing, and they follow the mechanism. And each night they go, tick, not my doing, a happening as a result of circumstance I found myself in that I wasn't in control of. A thought, which I used to think was my thought, but actually when I look at it, is a thought that is inspired completely by the circumstance and my genes and up-to-date conditioning. What's your name?
Kristen.
Okay, I did know your name was Kristen, but the point being, I ask a question. Circumstance you find yourself in, not in your control. You had no idea I would ask a question. So you find yourself in a situation and you hear something. The brain processes what you hear based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I spoke to you in English. Your history, your up-to-date conditioning is that you understand English. So you then answered the question in the only way you could have in this moment, based on the circumstance and your up-to-date conditioning. The answer, we would insist, is my doing. When we look at it more closely, the suggestion is you couldn't have answered any other way. Theoretically, we say, well, I could have said my name is John. In theory. But in practice, you answered one way. The way you did, and that explanation I have is that the way you answered is based on the circumstance that you had no control over, and your genes and up-to-date conditioning you had no control over. And to the extent that we see that a thought arises in exactly the same way, not a thought I had control over, but a thought that was pulled out of me by the circumstance and my makeup. Then we start seeing, wow, life is happening, there's no doubt about that, but am I in control of what happens in each moment? And so after 30 days of putting a tick next to these situations that you're investigating, at the end of it you might go, I simply cannot be the doer. Upon investigation, each time I find not my doing, a happening. And so then you might say to someone, you know, it doesn't appear to me that we're the doers of anything that happens. It seems like everything is a happening, and I now can't see the things that happen as my doing because I've investigated this for 30 days. And the friend says, I understand what you're saying, but I'm not convinced. And you go, I understand where you're coming from. Believe me, 30 days ago, I said exactly the same thing. And if that person does the investigation, and it's destiny, it depends on whether it's destiny, it depends on whether the investigation unfolds a particular way, whether the person finds the motivation to do it each day, whether even with the investigation, and someone might say, yes, not in control of this, not in control of that, but I don't see how it's not my doing. That would be their genes and up-to-date conditioning, assessing a situation differently to how I've assessed it, how Ramesh has assessed it. But if that's the case, I could understand it, that somehow the investigation is not revealing to that person that everything is a happening. So I would say, well, destined for it to be like that based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. But I wouldn't say it's accurate, but it happens. But if they investigate and time again they find, wow, not my doing, a happening, then at the end of the 30 days, maybe at the end of 2 days, it doesn't really require 30 days, it doesn't even require you to do the investigation. If the intellectual description makes complete sense to you, you might say, I don't need to do any investigation. I get it. Not my doing, not your doing. So however it unfolds, when we become absolutely convinced from our own seeing of life that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer, then in a situation when the other delivers pain, we can't help but see it as a happening. I can't see it differently. Now that I've seen that the human being is made up of these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, I've looked to find a third factor. And as far as the biological and the psychological aspects of the human being go, I can't find a third factor. So then it's not just a belief, but it's actually our seeing of the situation that's uprooting the false belief, the opposite belief. And the other forms of suffering are worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. So based on the idea of myself needing pleasure in life in order to be complete, it makes sense that we will then feel worried about how life is going to turn out, imagining that life is going to deliver pain to me. So that's worrying. I'm worried about a potential pain that could happen. And in its extreme form, in its intense form, worry is anxiety, where we're almost convinced that something terrible has already happened, and I'm just waiting to find out. And then there is the form of suffering which is being called here expectation and attachment to outcome. So expectation is along the lines of thinking I need pleasure, 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 and having an idea of how the other should act, how I should act, what my life should look like. So an expectation of what I think life should look like. And attachment to outcome refers to how we feel when life turns out the way it was always destined to turn out, which is different to our expectation. Expectation can arise as a continuous thinking about our future and what I would like to happen and how it's going to happen and how I can control everyone else so that they deliver what I want, and how I can control myself in order to deliver what I want. And that expectation turns into a feeling of disappointment, which we could call attachment to outcome. Not only disappointment, but sometimes it's a sense that everything has suddenly gone terribly wrong on a deep level of self when we receive certain news about things. So that's the attachment to outcome. And we can see that all of that is based very much on this belief that what I am, what my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. So, and then blame, we'll go back to blame, where we see the other as the doer, is also very linked to the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So it's when the other does something that delivers pain to us, that we see them as the doer. We hate them for the pain they have delivered, which is an attack on who I am, essentially. So if these are the 5 forms of suffering, and let's recap on that very important question that we need to ask ourselves. It's the beginning of this set of pointers. It says, doesn't it make sense if you find yourself seeking, to ask yourself, what am I really seeking? What am I really looking for? And the suggested answer is, humans for all of time have been looking for happiness. If we drop any concepts about what we're seeking for, drop the idea of enlightenment, drop the idea of trying to save the world, drop the idea of looking after my family, drop the idea of making money, and we say, actually, all of those things I was doing because I believe it's going to make me happy. So really what I'm looking for is happiness. When we look at it, humans are all moving, looking for happiness, by and large looking in a place that happiness isn't to be found out there, which really means looking for the flow of life, circumstance, to deliver happiness. So it doesn't mean that we're not looking for happiness. We are looking for happiness, we're just looking for happiness in the wrong place. So then we have to say, so what is happiness really? If happiness isn't happiness through pleasure, and it's not happiness and pleasure, happiness isn't happiness through pleasure, because billions and billions of people for hundreds and thousands of years have been seeking happiness in pleasure. It's like the whole human population for all of time has been in search of something. They've all been looking in that place, and no one has found it there. So we can conclude, actually happiness isn't to be found in pleasure. Strangely enough, there's this deeply ingrained belief that all humans have for a period of time that says it is to be found in pleasure. And if our up-to-date conditioning is affected in such a way by teachings, so this teaching is saying, hey, check your own experience. Is happiness to be found in pleasure? You've had enough pleasure, you've received pleasure, and each time you get pleasure, It feels good, pleasure is pleasurable, but it doesn't give you what you're looking for on a continuous, unbroken basis. It doesn't give you the happiness that will carry through forever and survive regardless of the situation you find yourself in. So the teaching is bringing about a reconditioning where we might click, have an insight. Wow, I'm looking for happiness and pleasure. Everyone else is looking for happiness and pleasure. No one is finding it there. I'm not finding there, and I keep looking for it there. Time and time again, I keep looking, thinking, okay, well now, this time, today I will find it. I will get the pleasure, and this pleasure will be the one that delivers it to me. At some point, we click, maybe it's not there. Maybe it's not to be found in pleasure. So, what is human happiness? That's the question. What am I really looking for? Yes, I'm looking for happiness. It's not happiness through pleasure. That's not happiness, that's pleasure. Turns out that happiness for the human being is peace of mind, continuous, unbroken peace of mind, unwavering peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. And what is peace of mind? Peace of mind is not the gaining of anything. That would be pleasure. Not even the gaining of a nice feeling. So, the feeling of excitement that my friend is coming, that's what we normally call, oh, I'm happy. I'm excited that my friend is coming. That's pleasure. It's a form of pleasure. But because we've mixed up happiness and pleasure, we think that happiness is a feeling. That's pleasure. So what's peace of mind? Peace of mind is not something gained. It's the absence, the removal, the non-arising of suffering. So to the extent that we find ourselves living life and suffering isn't there, meaning no expectation of how life should look, no worry about the future, no anxiety, no pride, no guilt, no blame. That's a description of living life where we are present with the present moment, so not looking into the past and having regrets, which is guilt and blame, not looking into the future and having expectations and feeling worried, and being in the present without complaining. That really means that we find that when someone describes that, they say, well, actually, it just feels like this moment is enough. That there isn't a running away from this moment. There isn't a resisting what's happening in this moment. Even when circumstance is painful. Even when government puts in place a policy that you look at the policy and say, this is terrible. Why is government policy terrible? Government policy can be looked at from a particular individual's perspective as terrible because it's going to deliver a circumstance that's painful. I'm going to have to pay higher taxes, financial pain, or I'm going to have restrictions on where I can park my car, which is pain in the form of inconvenience. Or I'm going to, not be allowed to visit a country that I like visiting. Painful relative to our preferences. So why people are up in arms about government is because there's the deeply ingrained belief, my happiness, my completeness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. Government comes in and says, hey, they're changing this. People look at it and go, that's very painful to my situation. And then I hate you. I hate you for what you've done. I hate you for what you're going to do. What you're going to do is deliver pain to me. And that's how we tend to find that we live life until we start to become aware of this dynamic and maybe start to see that our attitude to what happens in the flow of life is based on a set of false ideas. Because it turns out that the suffering is always attitudinal, meaning the suffering is not caused by the circumstance. The circumstance is pleasure or pain, and suffering is an uncomfortableness with the circumstance. Suffering is psychological, not biological. So the pain in the moment of not being able to park your car in an area where you used to be able to park your car, that's inconvenience and it's pain relative to your preferences. The suffering is attitudinal, that says, this is ridiculous that I can't park my car outside my own home because there's these parking restrictions. That's extra on top of the pain of not being able to park your car. There is this resistance, this attitudinal resistance saying life shouldn't be like this. The other people that have enforced this are my enemies for what they chose to do. Of their own volition, they chose to put these laws in place. And if we remember, whatever happens is a happening according to the story of life, and the other person is just the instrument through which that story is being implemented. And if I look at it on a cause and effect basis, the person is doing exactly what they're destined to do based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. So they had the thought and said, this is a great idea, let's do it. Based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance that they found themselves in. So suffering is always attitudinal, meaning my attitude to the flow of life. The flow of life means pleasure or pain in the moment based on the circumstance and how that circumstance matches or doesn't match our biological preferences, what we would like versus what we wouldn't like. So suffering is always attitudinal. Peace of mind is the absence of suffering, which really means the absence of the wrong attitude. The attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is the attitude that delivers suffering. Suffering is what blocks our peace of mind. And peace of mind is what humans are looking for. So what am I really looking for? I'm looking for happiness. It turns out that happiness for the human being is continuous unbroken peace of mind. Continuous unbroken peace of mind is simply the absence of suffering. Suffering in practical terms arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. Guilt, blame, pride based on the belief that I'm the doer, the other's the doer. Worry and anxiety, expectation, attachment to outcome based on the belief my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. So the absence of that attitudinal suffering has to be the correction of the two false beliefs, that I'm the doer, the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure. That really is, once that happens, it's the end of the search. No more searching, because we end up finding that we have what we're really looking for, peace of mind. The peace of mind means I find this moment good enough. The moment is always changing. I always find it good enough, and so what am I seeking? Seeking is a form of suffering. But we are forced to seek for as long as these false beliefs are in place, because when the false beliefs are in place, they arise as an uncomfortableness, which means I have to move away from this uncomfortableness. And then when the uncomfortableness dissolves, the seeking stops. So really we're looking for the end of seeking, we're looking for the end of suffering, and suffering is based on a false idea of who we are, that life put in place as part of the story of life. And the core error is I'm the doer, the other is the doer, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And that gets in the way of us knowing what we are at our core, what we were talking about this morning. obsessive movement of judging life, judging myself, judging the other, being attached to situation, is this thinking that keeps us very much in the head, not able to recognize the subtle aspects of the present moment, the subtle aspects of who we are. So a combination of not knowing myself in such a way that I can always find myself and rest in my being, and the false beliefs that I'm the doer and blah, blah, blah. That's the problem. So to the extent that life at some point starts dissolving those errors, starts bringing into the present moment an awareness of what we are at our core, then the problem is getting solved. And to the extent that you find yourself sitting here for a whole weekend, even though on the one hand we might look at it and say, everything's predetermined, I'm not in control of anything, well, that doesn't sound great. The fact is that out of your complete lack of control, destiny has put you here, which means you didn't need to be in control to be here. Life got you here. You know, an email popped up in your inbox, circumstance you had no control over. According to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, you either deleted, the people that press delete according to genes and up-to-date conditioning, not here. Those that saw whatever the heading was, go, okay, interesting. Let me see what it's about. You open the email, you read it. Some people open the email, read it and go, not at all for me. I'm not the doer. What are they talking about? Everything's happening according to God's will. Are you crazy? And I'm not going to listen to that nonsense. They're not here. Unless something happens in life, which does happen sometimes, and a friend of theirs opened the email and went, this is fantastic, great, I'm going. And so they book in, and then this is like 2 months earlier, and the friend has said, then I'm not going to that nonsense. And then day before, the friend that has signed up says to their friend, I'm going to a talk tomorrow. Come with me. And the friend goes, tomorrow I'm not doing anything. Yeah, okay, I'll come with you. And they turn up here, and say, but that's the thing I deleted. And here I am. That's destiny. And similarly, someone who really wants to come, this is great, excellent, they plan it, and then a day before, their circumstance changes and they have to go and help a sick family member or something, and they don't make it. So we're not in control, but we're here. And so life has essentially conspired to put us here in a situation where life is bombarding you, because that's what these talks are, it's bombarding you with new conditioning. New conditioning is what life is always delivering, which is affecting our up-to-date conditioning. So new conditioning can change our up-to-date conditioning a little bit, or it can radically change our up-to-date conditioning. Or you can have new conditioning that doesn't stick at all, so it doesn't change our up-to-date conditioning at all. So Ramesh would say, no need to be pessimistic. You're not in control, but look, it's happening anyway. So, and especially when the process unfolds more and more, and we realize that, wow, the process has been happening for quite some years. I've been having all sorts of insights and realizations, and I see that I'm not the doer, and yet these insights and realizations are happening. I'm finding myself reading certain books, and the content of the books is creating certain thoughts, and one thought leads to another thought, creates more contemplation, and then bang, insight. And really, once we become clear on seeing this, we realize I couldn't have orchestrated all of this. I know that I say it often. If I was in control of the 4 or 5 year process that happened, I would have really messed it up on day 2. And yet it just kept flowing. Investigation and contemplation starts happening in my dreams, and circumstance happens in such a way that it supports what's being investigated, what's being pointed at in the books that I'm reading or the videos that I was reading. Suddenly a circumstance happens that completely demonstrates the principle that life has brought in. And the situation then deepens the contemplation that's happening, and then bang, out of the blue, spontaneously an insight happens where the subject that is being chewed on clicks into place. And once it clicks into place, it's like, of course. And the insights I'm talking about, there can be hundreds of these insights that all key in to each other. So I'm not saying we have an insight and that's it, all done, one insight. And there are thousands of little insights that all add in together to eventually result in us waking up, not just one day out of the blue. It's this really gradual process, and you realize, wow, I simply can't see life like I used to. In fact, I wonder, how could I possibly have seen life like that? It just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. And we wake up after a whole process of little things clicking into place. We're a completely different person, essentially, because of the process that has happened before, that has changed our up-to-date conditioning. Primarily the up-to-date conditioning that is the up-to-date conditioning that we can call the thinking mind, that results in the psychological suffering. The biological aspects of the human being are going to be more or less the same. We're going to have more or less the same personality, more or less the same preferences, more or less the same tendencies. But on an attitudinal level, we will be radically different. And some of our behaviors that were linked to our attitude will change. But we don't become different too much on a biological level. Attitudinally, though, everything is completely different.
So it seems like the whole concept of cause and effect can really be surrendered completely. Mm-hmm. I mean, on the one hand, it seems like, yes, we take actions based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. That looks like cause and effect. But on the other hand, if it's all carried, then cause and effect is negated. Is that, am I correct?
If it's all carried?
If all of this is being carried, and as Ramesh would say, the film's in the can, mm-hmm. then really there's no cause and effect.
Cause and effect is in the can.
Cause and effect is in the can.
Yeah. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the story that is in the can is a story of cause and effect, meaning it appears that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. You could actually look at it like D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A, meaning maybe the end was put in place first, like a writer who writes a book and then, I've got a great ending for a book. And then they say, well, now I need to have a beginning, and a middle. Or you can look at it as each moment is completely independent of the one before it and the one after it, which means there is no cause and effect because each moment is spontaneously new, but what is spontaneously new appears to be linked to what we could say the previous moment. But they're all fresh. So, on the one hand, cause and effect is an illusion. Everything is spontaneously arising in this present moment. But what is arising in the present moment is a story of cause and effect, a story that appears to be causal, a story that appears to be a story of time and space and duality. So this links in with what we were saying this morning about experience is in essence all non-dual, meaning that the awareness and the content arise together and are dependent on each other. There has to be awareness in order for there to be experience. It's awareness of the content is experience. So all experience is non-dual. The content is designed to seem like there is separation of all the different objects. But that's contained in the makeup of the experience. It's a single experience, like a single painting. The painting over there has lots of different objects in it. So it's a painting designed to appear like many. Actually, when you look at it objectively, you go, oh, it's just one painting. There's no separation between the mug and the ducks. They are all part of the one painting. And yet, in appearance, the duck seems different to the mug. And so the experience is always non-dual. It's always a single arising in consciousness. But the content of the non-dual experience can be content such that it is experienced as a duality. So duality, on the one hand, we can't deny cause and effect. The experience is that if I drop a glass on the floor, it's going to break. So if I say cause and effect is an illusion, cause and effect is unreal, then I'm denying, I'm overlooking something that in practice is always going to appear to be real. That dropping a glass on the floor has an effect. So dropping is the cause and smashing is the effect. And in the same way, we can say that the whole life experience is an illusion, is not real. So from one perspective, that is accurate from one perspective. On the other perspective, I don't want to go around saying it's not real because someone's going to hit me on the head with a broom and it's going to hurt. And they'll go, but the broom isn't real and your head isn't real. Everything's unreal. So we realize when we start saying things that we can be a bit deluded if we hold on to something too absolutely. So we're definitely right. You can say cause and effect is not as absolute, is probably the way I'd like to say it. Not as absolute as we might think. But then we don't go around saying cause and effect absolutely doesn't exist, because there's that other part of daily living, practical daily living, where we have to live life as if it's real. We have to live life as if cause and effect is real. And we have to live life as if it's a duality, knowing deep inside that it's a non-duality. But the experience at the end of this of a process still has us living life as if it's a duality, experiencing life as if it's a duality. So let's go back to cause and effect, if that's not finished.
Well, what I'm wondering is, I'm considering the amount of time spent on the consideration of cause and effect in a lifetime. Just the mental spin around, well, if this, then that. If this happens, I'm going to feel this way. If I do this, so-and-so's going to feel that way. And just the the amount of energy and time spent on if this, then that.
Mm-hmm.
And the, proactive dread or joy. So, as somebody who's fully realized the non-duality aspect of the whole thing, can you speak to what is your experience of time? Has your experience of time passing changed? Like, is your time filled with something other than pondering cause and effect, or if this, then that?
So the if this, then that, which is, so we've come to see life as an objective reality. When we pop into life, it feels real, the experience feels real, so we draw the conclusion, it is real, and it feels like an objective reality, so then we relate to life as an objective reality, which based on time and space. That's the experience of life, time and space. And because it's an experience of time and space, there's the presupposition that gets put in place that A leads to B, cause and effect. So we start looking at everything as if cause and effect is absolutely real. And at some point, a teaching will come along and say, actually, everything's completely predetermined. Or it will come along and say, cause and effect is not the reason why things happen. Cause and effect is an illusion. Time is an illusion. All sorts of pointers and comments that are completely foreign to us. Like, what are you talking about? Time is an illusion. Cause and effect isn't real. The world is unreal. These are all pointers to snap us out of seeing life absolutely one way. And when they snap us out of it, we tend to see life differently, and then we start saying things that are also a little deluded, but on the other side of the thing. Like we say, time doesn't exist. I have absolutely no choice. We come to see the error of our ways, in a sense, and then swing to the other extreme. And we might realize that we're a bit maybe taking them too far, where we're insisting that time and space is not real. And then someone says, so what are you going to do next week? Can we meet up? And I say, oh yeah, next Thursday I'll be in such and such, let's meet at 6 o'clock. So 1 minute I might be saying, time is absolutely unreal, cause and effect is absolutely unreal, and without even knowing it, the question comes and I answer it in such a way that demonstrates, but on some level, time exists. You relate, because if I truly believe time didn't exist, when someone says, what are you doing next week? I have to look at them blankly, like, I don't understand the question. Next week? What's that? And sometimes you could get, when someone's in that phase, they go, well, all there is now. What are you doing next week? All there is now. I'm making fun. These are very legitimate. It's part of the process to really get these things ingrained in us. One, that certain ways of relating to life are not as absolute as we had thought, and to deeply ingrain us seeing from another perspective. And then eventually everything starts to get integrated, where we find this middle ground where we're not so extremist, we're not a vigilante against language and against certain things like we can tend to become for a while. And so what's my relation to time is I find that it's important to make a distinction between psychological time. Psychological time is based on being obsessed with the past and the future, feeling like it is a determinant of who I am, And so if I believe that who I am is dependent on what has happened in the past and what will happen in the future, then that's psychological time. It's an imagination of a past and a future that doesn't really exist right now. And I'm hanging on to the past and future as if it determines who I am. If that's fallen away, the attachment, then I can find that practical time is still accepted as a phenomena, and it doesn't disturb my peace of mind because my identity is not dependent on practical time. A connection to self exists and is recognized now, and in the same instant I understand this story, which is a story of time and space, gets lived as if time is real, as if cause and effect is real. So there's no conflict. When someone says, "What are you doing next week?" I say, "Oh, next week I'm going to be in LA." And what falls away is exactly like the obsessive thinking that is forced to be there when we feel that what I am is dependent on the past and the future. We're forced to keep thinking about the past and the future to keep ourselves alive. I mean, if we don't think about the past and the future, we don't dissolve. We're still here. But the belief is that I can't let go of the past, and I can't relax and allow the future to just unfold as it unfolds in the present moment. So a whole lot of thinking does stop. That thinking is essentially the guilt, the blame, pride, worry, and expectation. What takes its place is presence with what is, in a sense, just appreciating the experience that is without the experience being disturbed by all of that obsessive thinking. I do tend to think a lot. My nature is that my intellect is such that it's one of the faculties that I appreciate and I enjoy, and so I will think about subjects, but the thinking is what we could call the working mind, practical thinking, not fantasy about the past and the future. So even though a large part of thinking has stopped, which is the end of the thinking mind, I find that the working mind is still very active. But the working mind is not a form of suffering. The working mind is simply part of the experience at the moment. The working mind is thought objects arising in the moment, and they're not thought objects that are constructed in a way that creates suffering or a veil to the core of who we are. Is that
Thank you.
good
Yes.
enough? When you ask about time, it's always a bit tricky, because time is much less linear than we think, and I don't know that I actually understand time as a quantum physicist does. But what really is important is this notion of psychological time that keeps us disconnected from what is right now. So the meditation that we were running through this morning would cut off the belief in psychological time and say, what is there present right now? Is the past that we might have an impression of in the form of a memory? Is that past actually here right now, or is the past in the present as the result of a thought object, memory? And when we see, the past doesn't exist right now, it only exists as a thought object, and the thought object isn't the past. So then a thought that is somehow believed to be more than a thought, and a memory is just a thought, a memory or a thought that is believed to be more than that might be seen to be what it is, and it falls away. It's like, that's not truth, that's relative. And the present moment doesn't tell me about a past. and the same with the future. So if psychological time collapses, we find ourselves in the present.
So would you say that it's not about working with yourself to necessarily stay out of the past and the future, but just that as these realizations really sink in, that psychological time collapses or falls away on its own? And it's like cart before the horse, kind of.
Yeah, or so that's it. We don't need to work hard and say, I'm going to remain in the present. That tends to be the doer. So the doer could say, I need to start accepting life. I need to stop judging life. Because there's awareness has landed on the fact that that judgment, that non-acceptance, actually isn't serving me. It's unfortunate that that's there, relative to peace of mind anyway. So at some point we realize and we go, I really have to accept life more. I'm going to work hard at accepting. I'm going to start accepting. And who's saying that? The doer is saying that, that it's going to accept. And when we look at the mechanics of non-acceptance, which is, let's say, blame, guilt, resistance basically to how life has turned out, when we look at it, it's based on two beliefs, your genes and your up-to-date conditioning. The beliefs. I'm the doer, the other's the doer. My happiness, my fullness, my completeness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so if those beliefs don't get addressed, and someone says, I really need to accept life, I'm going to work hard at accepting life, that's my mission, it's New Year's resolution, put up on the board. And then the minute they step out into life and life is painful, bang, non-acceptance happens. On day one, the 1st of January, non-acceptance. And they think, oh, okay, tomorrow I'm going to do a better job. And tomorrow, same thing, pain in the moment, non-acceptance. Because non-acceptance isn't something we can do. Non-acceptance is a happening based on genes and up-to-date conditioning, which include these beliefs. If life undoes those beliefs, then you step outside on 1st of January, that pain, whatever it was, is there. The pain is experienced, but suffering or non-acceptance doesn't arise. The person doesn't have to work hard. This is a bad example because the person that writes that resolution on the board, it means that those two beliefs are in place. And so on day one, they're going to step out and there is going to be non-acceptance happening. But let's say someone where life has undone those beliefs, or they were never strong in the first place, finds themselves walking out, la la la, bad, pain in the moment, and naturally, their attitude is an attitude of equanimity or an attitude of, c'est la vie. And what makes someone have an attitude that says, this stuff happens, these things happen, versus someone who is, sees that the person that has delivered the pain as an absolute enemy and is focused in that moment on, eliminating the enemy. It's simply the makeup. So to the extent life undoes that, we find ourselves unable to relate to the past and the future in the same way as we used to. And so once again, if we think, I have to stop thinking about the past, and we don't realize why we think about the past, we think about the past because we think that what happened in the past somehow is very relevant to who I am. And so letting go of what happened in the past when we see it as completely relevant to who I am just isn't going to happen. It can't happen. It's only when we realize, that had nothing to do with who I am, that we can let it go. If someone does something that hurts us, someone betrays us, and it's felt to be an attack on who I am, and someone says, just let it go. In a way, it would be, if when that belief is in place, it's in a way a lack of self-respect to let it go, to just pretend it's not important. If it really was an attack on who I am, it would be a lack of self-respect to let it go. And that's what we normally think, so we can't let these things go. It just doesn't make sense to let them go. But once we see it has nothing to do with who I am, then these things happen and they don't stick. They're not personal. So, someone might come back and say, "Oh, I'm sorry that I yelled at you the other day." And it's like, "Oh, really? Did you? Oh, no problem." Because the memory of the event isn't held on to in the same way as when someone yells at you and it's completely personal. And when they leave and we're thinking about it and feeling guilty or feeling blame towards them and chewing on it. And then when they say, "Oh, I'm sorry that, finally you've apologized," very different when we're holding on to it and it's personal.
Thank you.
Yes. Tell us about the postal service.
Oh, no. My question had to do with the working mind. Is the working mind involved in the creative process? Something that I learned not too long ago was how Muji used to be a real artist, and then it was like he was a painter, and then it was he almost implied that he couldn't do both, that he had to let that go to do this other life. And also, is the working mind involved in studying like a language or something like that?
Mm-hmm. So studying a language, for sure, that's the working mind. If you're learning how to, if you're an artist and someone says, "Hey, let me show you some new techniques that maybe you haven't come across," and they show you and you look at them and go, "Oh, that makes sense. I've never thought about mixing paint with soil," or whatever. It's the working mind that has registered the new information. And the working mind doesn't get in the way of creativity. It can very much be part of creativity. So Ramesh used to mention a story about a surgeon, a very, very fine surgeon. And he was very good at his job, a brain surgeon. Very good at his job. And he would go about operating, using the working mind to help him as part of the operation. But there was nothing in the way of the flow, his natural talent and his understanding of what needed to be cut and fixed and what have you. One day, a very, very important politician, the most important politician in the country, is admitted for brain surgery. And the brain surgeon, who is naturally talented and starts worrying about what if the politician dies. And in this particular country, people tend to blame, let's say, a doctor for that. What if the politician dies? And so that thinking, what's going to happen? That thinking is a form of suffering, worry and expectation. And that could get in the way of the surgeon's natural ability and the working mind that is normally at work. So the thinking mind can get in the way of that efficiently happening. So when an artist says, and artists know this very well, that when they hear, "I'm not the doer," when they find themselves painting, their experience really tells them, wow, I was out of the way, I wasn't there. Painting was happening. And so that's in a way, that's a peak experience that and when I use the word peak experience, it doesn't have to be super peak, but just different to the normal daily life experience, where life is showing us that there's no one here painting, and yet painting happens. There's no doer that is painting. And it's trying to show us that even when it feels like I'm the doer, the principle is the same. It's all just happening. But the thinking mind effectively is a component of thinking that tends to prevent this natural flow. So artists will say, I can't claim ownership over this piece. It just happened. You know, it was creativity flowing through me, and yet people will say, will pay $50,000 for it, and the artist gets to benefit from that. You know, so they, in practice, the fact that everything's happening through you doesn't mean that society isn't going to reward you for things that happen through you. And so creativity is the working mind, or at least includes the working mind, but not the thinking mind. And as for Muji saying something, it would be I'd have to be guessing, in a sense, what he means. I can imagine that one thing he means is that having to, being in a position where there's so many thousands of people that he needs all the time he has to deal with satsang, and so he might not have the time or energy to paint anymore.
Sounds logical.
I'm sure that he would still have the capacity to paint. Well, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that this transformation doesn't take away one's capacity to function. So when you listen to a satsang, on the one hand it's flowing because no one's in the way, no one's claiming ownership over it, and it's consciousness flowing through us like consciousness flows through everything all the time. But without the doer in place, it really feels like it's flowing through, and answers for questions. And on the other hand, you look at what is flowing through, and it's definitely requires discernment, and answers come because the working mind is at play. And so if you watch any teacher, they tend to be able to spot what needs to be said, what the blocks are. And that spotting is both a combination. On the one hand, you can just say it's the intelligence of consciousness flowing through, and on the other hand, you can say it's the working mind that is observing the situation and is discerning one thing from the other based on the experience of the working mind.
So I think kind of a practical question. So it would kind of related to like small suffering. Towel on the floor in the bathroom. Walk in the door, family member left the towel on the floor in the bathroom. Pick it up, move on. Walk in the room and go, oh, towel on the floor in the bathroom. Is there suffering in the family member left the towel on the floor in the bathroom for the 3 seconds that it exists?
No, not necessarily. It depends on what the feeling is at the time of seeing the towel on the floor.
Little frustration.
Yeah.
Little frustration. Oh, family member left the towel on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
Off on to the rest of whatever's flowing.
Yeah. So even frustration, the word frustration in that case doesn't necessarily imply suffering.
Okay.
So a situation is either pleasure or pain, according to your preferences. And so clearly our preferences are, let's say, that towels aren't left on the floor. Well, your preference and mine too, and many people's preferences, it's a normal preference to have. Well, obviously not your kids, maybe. So we see it, and it's pain in the moment. The circumstance, not in line with our preferences, pain in the moment. When there's pain in the moment, there's going to be a biological reaction to pain in the moment. Now, that means that if you stub your toe, ow, will happen, which is the biological reaction, or a swear word. And even that's not great, because that just seems like it's just words. But you could get angry in the moment. The anger arises vertically in the moment and subsides. And that anger is a biological reaction. If I see someone about to break the window of a car, hey, not, oh, he's about to break my window. So that shouting is a biological reaction of anger. No suffering in that, if it's just that. If included in that, there is a feeling that that person shouldn't have done that. Like, not on the level, like, sure, when you see someone, automatically you're saying, you shouldn't be about to break my car window. But once it's happened, if it's related to as though that was an attack on who I am, essentially that's where the suffering kicks in. Like, first thinking that life shouldn't, it's not possible for life to, so relative to my property, you shouldn't break my window. So that's relative to the benchmark of my property and how I would like it to be treated. But that benchmark doesn't have to be a benchmark that is synonymous with your completeness. That benchmark is a benchmark relative to how I'd like my property treated, and I understand that it is just a benchmark of pleasure versus if the benchmark, if what happens is somewhere away from that benchmark, that's pain. Right? So relative to the benchmark of how am I treated, that is not ideal, breaking my car window. But to the extent that I don't have a benchmark in about my completeness, then I can get angry relative to the benchmark of how I'd like my property treated, biological anger, but there's the understanding that life can turn out anyway, and this is one way it turns out. And furthermore, knowing that however life turns out is not an attack on my being. And so what you have to go to is the feeling yourself and see inside if there's an uncomfortableness that lingers. The anger is pain, that's vertical. The question is there horizontal suffering after that? And if it lasts for 2 seconds, and it is suffering, right, for 2 seconds, who cares, right? Really, not the spiritual question, who cares, right, as in asking who is there to care, but like in practical terms, who cares if you suffer for 2 seconds? If you're suffering for 10 minutes, it's a bit more of an issue. If you suffer once every 3 months, who cares? If we set up some expectation that, and based on the teachings as well, this teaching says, enlightenment, peace of mind is the end of suffering. Like, end of suffering means, or it implies, suffering never to happen again. Technically, that's correct. When the beliefs are completely dissolved, suffering doesn't have the basis on which to arise. That's technically, right? If suffering arises once every 6 months for 2 seconds, is that person unenlightened? Technically, you could say yes, because suffering arose for 2 seconds every 6 months. But practically, what's the difference between absolutely no suffering and suffering every 6 months for 2 seconds? I'll take either, thanks.
Right. So the intensity of the feeling of the towel on the floor, if it's vertical, is, I don't know if irrelevant's exactly the right word, but isn't isn't relevant. It's the horizontal. So, because I feel things big. And so there's this, there's an expectation that an enlightened person, then that part of the end of this, or whatever the word is, the intensity of the vertical will reduce.
Yep.
And that isn't happening.
No, it's not going to happen.
And so then I think, well, I got a long way to go. I got a few more satsangs to go to.
Yeah.
But when you talk about it as the, so I can see the vertical reaction, emotion, feeling, differently from the horizontal.
Yeah.
Completely differently. And so that's good news.
It is good news.
Yes.
We've got shock over here in the front. But it is good news is that...
Well, I'm curious when you say it's not going to happen.
Yeah. The biological reaction continues to unfold even after attachment to outcome has fallen away. The biological reaction is exactly that, a biological reaction. It's not suffering. The suffering is what we call the psychological reaction, based on the doership and attachment to outcome. And the psychological reaction is an uncomfortableness with oneself. The biological reaction doesn't include an uncomfortableness with oneself. So anger, if someone is about to hit, let's say someone's about to drive into your car, you can see that they're on their phone and they're not looking, it's in a car park, and you're outside of your car, and you see this guy rolling towards your car. The biological reaction, I won't do it because I have the headset on, but you can imagine what is going to come out in order for the person in the car to hear you, right? That you could call anger, right? At the situation. And the same thing is if you come back from the shops and pushing a trolley, you can pull up to the side of your car and it's all been sideswiped. Like a big truck has hit the side of your car and you can't open the doors. The moment you see that, it's like, there's a biological reaction. Just like if an elephant came walking in through the door, now, they don't have elephants in this part of the world. So it's like you're going to have a biological reaction. The biological reaction, including anger and sadness, is not suffering. The suffering is the attitude to the circumstance, sometimes even including your attitude to the biological reaction. So to the extent we say, I shouldn't get angry.
Right. So it's really easy for me with, the car hitting another car, the shopping cart running in. So where it gets a little harder is the husband and there's no way to not have personal preference around, let's just use the towel on the floor. And let's say that happens regularly, right? So that personal preference is hit against sometimes pretty regularly with somebody that you live with and spend a lot of time with. So that sort of, so the reaction of the vertical, oh, I hate that every time. Oh, I hate that. Oh, I hate that. Like, does that end? I mean, it doesn't, what doesn't go with it is, oh my God, okay, sometimes it does, but most of the time it doesn't have a whole story, the whole horizontal piece with it, but they're sort of waiting for, and I can see it sort of like, oh, I would be like in bliss then, because every time that person I live with did that thing, that preference prefers not to have, like that I would then not dislike that. Yeah, which seems illogical, but then there's this pressure to not have the vertical.
Yeah, that's the problem. The vertical is not your doing. It's a happening based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And there are going to be there are biological reactions that are painful, that are not biological reactions that are not going to deliver pleasure. So anger, when it arises, in itself is pain, and then it generally delivers more pain because people get upset that you're angry with them, and the fact that they're upset is something else to deal with, which is more pain. So our attachment to pleasure tends to not accept our biological reactions, which are pain. So because we have this want for life to be pleasure, 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 when a biological reaction which is unavoidable happens and it's pain, and it delivers more pain because someone else then gets angry back, we think, no, this is unacceptable. But actually it's completely acceptable as part of the flow. When I say acceptable, it's completely in line with the flow of life, which is pleasure sometimes and pain at other times. So to the extent we don't see that the biological reaction is just pain in the flow of life, just like stubbing our toe, or something else, then we'll expect it not to be there, want it not to be there, be attached to it not being there. And also if you think that, so that's one reason why we get attached to pain, to anger not being there, because anger generally is pain. The other reason we might be attached to it not being there is because we have the expectation, we think that enlightenment means acceptance of what is, and then we think that anger has to be non-acceptance. So we have this idea that if I accept everything as it is, I won't get angry. But that's not acceptance. Acceptance of what is doesn't mean you won't get angry. It means that biologically the situation has created anger, but the acceptance is on the psychological level, not on the biological level. So we can, and we've seen sages throughout time that are very angry at times. But the anger, so Nisargadatta, Ramesh's teacher, and the teaching that I came in contact with before Ramesh, Nisargadatta would get very angry with someone. How many times have I told you this? You must be stupid, get out. You know? And probably, I think, much more animated than that. And yet, in the next moment, the next day, if the person's back there, he'll have a joke with them. In fact, it happened that kicked someone out, and in the next moment, something funny happened, and he was laughing with the same person. Because it's not personal. To the extent that we take it personally, we're angry and it drags on. So you can't suddenly be present with something new. So this expectation that anger stops with this realization is an expectation that means each time anger arises, we'll go, oh, it hasn't happened. And then we get disappointed because we have an expectation that anger or that enlightenment is happening. And then we think that anger means enlightenment hasn't happened. And so we have this expectation of enlightenment, and therefore we have an expectation that anger isn't there. So it's another reason, not only that it's pain, but because we think it's a sign that enlightenment hasn't happened. If you find yourself at peace with your anger, that's a very good sign that the belief in personal doership and attachment to pleasure has fallen away. If you can find yourself at peace with someone else's anger, which doesn't mean that if someone were to come and hit you, you don't hit them back or run away, depending on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. It just means that someone hits you and you understand that that was destiny for there to be pain in the moment and for them to deliver the pain. And then you will see your reaction, your biological reaction of running away scared or hitting back, neither of which is better than the other. Or a third reaction is say, hey, let's talk about this, I think there's a mistake. Like, that seems like the best of the three. But actually, each one is just a biological reaction in the situation based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And to the extent that, let's say, we hit back, there is an acceptance that it was my destiny to be hit, and an acceptance that my biological reaction is to hit back. And then we move on without the story about can you believe what this idiot did, and you could still say later that evening and go, wow, I was in an incident today, someone came up and just hit me out of the blue. Just describing it, not hating the person or thinking that life has gone wrong. Life is a duality, good and bad. So the flow of life is always going to be pleasure and pain, and it's about extremes. So we see extreme acts of kindness and extreme acts of unkindness. And to the extent we understand life is a duality, it isn't fair. Life is not fair. To the extent we see that, then when something happens, it's painful, if it's a painful happening, but it's totally understandable. As part of the story of life, I understand why terrorist attacks happen. Understanding why terror doesn't make them pleasant at all. Right? But I also understand why when a natural disaster happens, you have people that flock to help. Very nice, and I understand why that happens. They're both part of the unfolding of life. And anger is part of the unfolding of life.
So let's say we agree on your suggestion that the original or the core error is that we think we are the doer and that we seek pleasure, 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 and then our attitude towards how. That brings me, if we agree on all of that, then it brings me down to this. So why? Why this error? Why did it even happen? Who made this mistake? Why did we come with this conditioning? That itself does not make sense. I mean, that really is a crime to me. That we are born into this body with this error, and we get to live a lifetime through it and suffer until we get it, or we don't get it, or whatever. But why that error? What is your explanation or your suggestion for the...
Right. So we're born into the body. We're not born into the body with the error. We're born into a body that has the error in it. The body has the error in it,
So
right?
why that? Why are we born into that body? Who planned that?
Well,
whose imperfect plan was that?
Yes. So before I answer whose plan it was, let's see. So the reason that we get born into the body with the error is so that we can experience life that way. However, the body allows us to experience life. So this experience of life is because the body forces us to see it like this. Mm-hmm. So if the body didn't have functioning eyesight, the experience would be of a different experience. Because the body is designed a certain way. And so the ingrained beliefs are part of the body. So when we come in here, we forced to experience life through the lens of the body. And these beliefs that obstruct a seeing of who we are at our essence, are there in order for that experience to be there. In order for the experience of life to be what it is. So Buddha, the first noble truth, life is suffering. So essentially what that means, the first noble truth is a recognition of the experience of life as it generally is. Life is suffering. The second noble truth, there is a way out of suffering. The third noble truth, to know the way out of suffering. And the fourth noble truth is the getting out of suffering, or nirvana. And so in a sense, it's a description of a progression that happens. So to start off the first one, life is suffering, is basically a description that this experience of life is an experience of suffering. That's why the error was put in place. in order for life to be the experience that it is, a life of suffering. And so we can say that life is a story of time, a story of space, a story of duality, a story of evolution. There is biological evolution, industrial evolution, technological evolution, coming to know ourselves, evolution. And at some point, the dinosaur was the vehicle through which life was being seen. That was the most complex form of life at some point. And now, the vehicle which is more complex that life is being experienced through is the human being. And so all of time, the whole story of time, came into existence in order for this experience to be had. And it's valid, just like a horror movie is a valid form of movies. It's a valid genre of entertainment. And so life is sort of a mix of drama, horror, comedy, romance, the whole mix in one. So it's the experience of life as we know it, for the sake of experience. And who created it implies a certain logic of cause and effect, and a certain logic of a creation and therefore a creator, which it makes sense that that's how we think, because we've come to see life as based on, time and space, cause and effect. And what that question implies is that the laws within this creation apply outside of the creation, apply universally, absolutely, which is not really the case. So asking, like, if we say God created everything, then someone says, who created God then? Because we are used to seeing things as cause and effect. And so then it says, well, everything has to have a cause. But outside of the manifestation, those rules maybe don't apply. Especially in the realm of what is outside the manifestation, outside of time and space, means eternal and infinite. Or the unmanifest even, prior to eternal and infinite. But having said that, the explanation given in the concepts, which is there because it's very useful for this question of happiness and peace of mind, it says that source at rest, meaning infinite potentiality. The word potentiality is very important. It means it's source but not manifest, but with potential. And so potential means at some point it needs to manifest, otherwise it wouldn't be potential. And so there's an actualization from potential to actuality or manifestation. Source at rest goes to source in movement. The unmanifest becomes the manifest. So infinite potentiality becomes the story of life. Infinite potentiality doesn't cognize, it doesn't think, what am I going to become next? It just becomes. And because of its nature as infinite creativity, what it becomes is always a masterpiece. It's not going to become something blah, no, meh, It will explode into creativity. And when we look at life, clearly, it's an amazing creation. Even the duality means good and evil, big and small, hot and cold, male and female, wealth and poverty, health and disease. They're all interconnected opposites. That's duality. And so when we look at the duality, it's an amazing creative expression of duality. And so no one has created it, but rather Source has become it. Source has become both the victim and the perpetrator. Source has become the oceans and the rivers and the mountains, all the people and everything that the people do from beginning of time to the end of time. Source has become an animated story of time and space. It's turned into this.
So when we say our destiny is predetermined, it doesn't mean, I guess it's the way my ego hears it. It's not predetermined by someone or something. It is predetermined on the base biological way or the way it has been born into existence, not by someone or something.
That's right. Not by an external. It hasn't been created by anything outside of it.
Okay.
Creation happened, and it's predetermined relative to the individual. Whatever I see in front of me, I know is not my creation. It's what I am aware of. And I had no control over it. So from my perspective, I say, well, it's predetermined to be exactly the way it is, which really is just implying not my control, not my doing. Because you can even drop predetermined once the beliefs that see life a particular way fall away and the suffering falls away, then you don't believe it's predetermined. These are the concepts. They're accurate. It's not that we just throw lies out that are useful lies.
Right.
They're accurate, but at some point you go, I just have to live life. So living life. So how do I live life if it's completely predetermined? Would be a question that Ramesh would say is a very valid question, and the answer is in each moment do exactly what you think or feel to do. And what it's saying is that the predetermined story is going to unfold with you doing exactly what you think or feel to do. And so you can relax and go, oh, it's that easy? So life becomes really simple. Whenever we think, oh, what am I going to do? It's really simple. Just in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. And maybe you'll realize that whatever I do is what was predetermined. Whatever I do, which I might call my free will, is actually God's will. And we say, I don't have free will as a separate, autonomous being, but I feel like I have free will, that's a gift. And so I continue to live as if I have free will. I live in the moment, it feels like, as if I can choose. And choices happen all the time. So when we look at the choice, we realize, that choice, which feels like my choice, is actually God's will. And then there's a marrying. It's like God's will and my will are not two.
Yeah, I think the moment you bring again the word God in there, then it gives me this old impression that somebody has decided for me, and then I have this natural resistance towards it. Like, even though I accept it, but there is resistance. Like, why?
So that's because you have a different concept. Why bring me here
and then decide it for me? I mean, this is a joke.
So God hasn't brought you here.
Right.
God has become you.
Right. That's then it starts. Yeah. No, I get it, and it's such a relief. Now I feel like all of a sudden my resistance is completely gone. Like, oh, okay, nobody did it to me. Like, it just. Yeah. It just.
Otherwise,
happened.
we're forced to hate God.
Yeah. Exactly.
I stopped blaming the other, but now I blame God.
With hate with respect, of course, but yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that makes a difference. Thank you.
That's exactly how long we have.
Okay. So I just wanted to ask about the word discernment. So you just ended by saying, we would choose by what we think and feel to do. Is that discernment?
The discernment comes before the final feeling of what we feel or think. So discernment, well, it's important, one, to bring in the notion of discernment versus judgment. So discernment is simply seeing a car going down the road very quickly, small road, car driving very fast. The discernment is that car is driving too fast or very fast down a small road. You could even say that driver is very reckless relative to a safety standard. So discernment is simply seeing something and commenting on it, or seeing it and understanding it for what it is. Judgment is where we see something, but instead of just it remaining a discernment, where it's not assessed as being appropriate or inappropriate relative to the experience of life. So when we discern someone driving really quickly down a road, we can assess it as inappropriate relative to safety standards, right? Which then means probably pain in the moment if an accident happens. To the extent that we are attached to pleasure, 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 what normally happens is we discern something as being painful or potentially painful, and then we judge it as inappropriate because it means pain in the moment, and we're insistent on life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So now it gets judged, and the judgment is a judgment of the other as being the doer, and therefore we blame the other, we hate the other. So that's judgment. Discernment is simply seeing it as it is. And so how discernment would fit into the question of decision making, doing what you think or feel to do, will be a process, a cognitive process, or a biological feeling process, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I tend to be quite calculated in decisions. It's just the way my genes and up-to-date conditioning is, which means I'll look at a situation. Maybe, let's say, I'm asked by a friend to help them, and I look at the amount of work that I have to do and how much time I have and how important it is to my friend, what it is that they're asking me to help them with, how tired I might be biologically, physically, and that is the assessment, which you could say a discernment of the situation, and at some point a decision of what I think I should do or what I feel to do, whichever way you're designed to function. Because if you function based on what you think you should do all the time, and let's say your shoulds are, I have to help everyone because I need everyone to love me, because I believe that love from the other is my happiness. If that's our makeup and we have all these shoulds, it doesn't matter about all the other factors. They, in a sense, don't get taken any notice. And of course, and you just will, I should help, I have to help, yes, I'll help. And that's not saying that that's wrong. That's going to be based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. That your decision will be to do it from what I think I should do. And the answer will be yes. The other, where you're feeling, it means you're not necessarily following the rule of what you should do, but you've still got this discernment that includes some aspect of the intellect, and what you feel like based on your... And in the end, there's a decision that comes out. I feel like helping, or I feel like I can't help. And once again, it's not about one being the right choice and the other being the wrong choice. All three, I should help, I must help, absolutely I'm going to help, or I feel like helping or I feel like not helping. They're all valid, they're just different ways. So the point of this is not to say we should act a certain way, it's just to describe how we do act. So discernment is part of that process that ends up leading to a feeling or a thought.
Thank you.
So we've come to the end of the weekend. Thank you, everyone.